In this tutorial, we will review the traditional Hello World action that we wrote in one of our previous tutorials. So coding the Struts2 action involves several parts. There is mapping an action to a class, mapping a result to a view, and writing the controller logic in the action class. In the previous tutorials, we covered how to configure struts to map a URL such as hello.action to an action class to run the execute method in the Hello World action class. So let's move over to Eclipse and start reviewing. Action classes act as the controller in the MVC pattern. Action classes respond to a user action, execute business logic, or call upon other classes to do that, and then return a result that tells struts what view to render. Let's have a look at hello world.java. This is our action class, and we see here that it has very little logic. It only sets the custom greeting. So essentially, this is where all the major processing will take place, and in a complex web application, you will often call other classes to perform a bunch of logic, or you'll do inversion of control frameworks like Spring. Struts2 action classes usually extend the action support class, which is provided by the Struts2 framework. Now let's have a look. Eclipse can help us learn a lot more about the action support class. If we go to open declaration, source not found. So what we're going to do now is we are going to download the source and enable Eclipse to show it for us. Here is the Struts2 core source jar. So we'll go ahead and download that, save it, go back to Eclipse and set it up. And there we go. We have attached the source from an external download, and now we can see in detail what action support does for us. It implements a bunch of interfaces. Here it implements the execute method with a default return of success. In Struts2, the action class also kind of acts like a data transfer object in a way that we can actually get the name from the input form. This happens through the background magic of OGNL in the Struts2 framework. In the Struts1 framework, we actually had to write a form object to transport the data from the input form, so which in our case is the hello world input form. Let's just go back and have a look at that. This is actually the name entry form. You'll see the name, and you see it's almost like magic, but it's actually the framework that does the data transfer from the form to the action for us. Another thing to mention is essentially Java Beans properties. And then finally, the action returns the control stream for routing the result, which is in our case is success. We go back to our Struts XML configuration. Success forwards it to hello world.jsp. Another thing that we can look at here is packaging our actions. When we look at our definition, we see a package name of hello world, and our action name forwards to hello world/hello world.jsp, which essentially means that the package name here is extending the root context of our JSP. Now, the reason we do this is often to organize a very complex type of Struts2 web application. So we might have something like inventory, e-commerce packages. This is something that we'll use as our application gets more and more complex. Another thing to look at here is that the namespace extends Struts default. So let's see if we can have a look at the Struts default configuration in our source package. I'm going to open the archive, and here we see the Struts default definition. And as we can see, we essentially build our application, which is very simple, on this very complex configuration, which includes the package name and a bunch of interceptors that does all the logic for us. All the magic happens here. if you want to do a deep dive and understand exactly what happens, this is what you look at. You look at the Struts 2 source. And that concludes our overview of the Struts 2 action. As you can see now that behind the scenes, the Struts 2 framework does a lot of the heavy lifting for us. See you in the next video.